And Bill, you said something very important in the book, that you need this third side or a third eye in this negotiation. And you were the third side in this part, because the two countries were going toward a conflict, and you played this role of the third side. And this, to me, sounds very, very important, because, in a way, all this creative mind to try to find the tone of the victory speech, if you bring this to a government, you'll be bombarded by people in the government saying, well, that doesn't work, that's futile, that's childish. They would try to undermine all your creative effort to find a path. So do you think this is the most important role of the third side in order to come to the conflict? Think in a creative way in order to find the better solution, that this minimum common denominator appears?
I do think so. I think it's, the third side can be a mediator, which we think of, but it doesn't actually have to be a mediator. It's often can be two players from both sides who can work together and constitute a third side. For example, in the conflict that I helped with Abilio Diniz, I was working for Abilio, but I constructed a relationship with someone who was the mentor of Abilio's former business partner, David. It was David de Rothschild, the French banker. And together, he and I were able to construct a third side that allowed to build a golden bridge that resolved that titanic business conflict between Abilio and Jean-Charles Naouri. So yes, I do believe that it's very useful in these really difficult situations, to look for, where's the third side? The third side are people who can stay on the balcony and can have the creativity and the intelligence, but also the inside knowledge to be able to build those golden bridges.
And the other example was Camp David. I think Camp David is a great example, because in this age of polarized politics, then we think it's impossible to find medium ground between parties. That's exactly what happened in that historical encounter where Menachem Begin from Israel and Anwar Sadat from Egypt, for the first time, bitter enemies became actually not friends, but they have a formal relationship that was fantastic for the Middle East. Could you tell us a little bit the scenario, the scene setting for the Camp David to provoke such a historical agreement as it was Camp David in the 1979?
Yes, so if you recall, in the 70s, there were 4 wars between Egypt and Israel. They were the 2 most powerful military adversaries in the Middle East. And everyone, as today, thinks the Middle East is the hardest, most impossible conflict. So there was that feeling back then too. And then Jimmy Carter had tried to mediate, but it didn't seem like it was working. And as a last-ditch effort, at the suggestion of his wife, Rosalind, actually, he decided to invite them to a beautiful place out in nature, which was Camp David, which is a presidential retreat outside of Washington, and see what they could do. And, and Menachem Begin and Anwar Al Sadat, there wasn't good chemistry between them. In fact, there was kind of like fire between them. And so from the very first day, after the first meetings, they decided to keep them separate in separate cabins. And then the question was, how do you build the golden bridge here? Egypt came with its position, which was they wanted the entire Sinai, which had been occupied by Israel in the war, in the 67 war was occupied. They wanted the entire Sinai Peninsula back. That was their position. Israel's position was also clear, but Begin wanted to keep a good slice of the Sinai as a buffer, a security buffer. And it seemed like, okay, are we going to draw a line in the sand, in the desert there? And there was no way. Both sides were so stuck in their positions and their peoples and so on. There's no way that was going to work. And so after 3 days, the Carter and the American Secretary of State, Cy Vance, turned to another idea, which was an idea actually that my colleague Roger Fisher and I had sent in a draft memo, to Cy Vance just before the Camp David summit. And it was a very simple kind of a creative idea of a process for how to break a deadlock. How do you build a bridge? And we call it the single negotiating text procedure. So we call it the one text. It's a very simple process, which is instead of starting from the positions, you start from the interests, right? You look at what does each side really want, and then you create a draft piece of paper, a document, in which you have an idea for how to build the bridge. But it's not a position, it's a very unofficial document, which then you, in an iterative process, you keep on getting criticism on until it becomes a document that actually can work for both sides. And this is the way it worked in Camp David, was the Americans went to the Israelis and said, okay, we understand your position. We're not asking you to change your position. Just tell us what you really want. What is your interest? The Israelis said, it's very simple, security. Egyptian tanks have attacked us four times in the previous 30 years. We don't want that happening again. The Americans then went to the Egyptians, asked the same question. We understand your position. You want the entire Sinai back. Why? Why do you want it? What's the interest there? Sovereignty. The land has been ours since the time of the pharaohs. We want it back. So then the Americans asked this magic question, which is, you may not be able to reconcile the positions, but how do we satisfy the Israeli interest in security and at the same time the Egyptian interest in sovereignty? And there was an idea floating around that was a kind of an interesting idea, which was a creative idea, a bridge, a golden bridge, which was a demilitarized Sinai. A Sinai where the entire Sinai would go to Egypt. The Egyptian flag could fly everywhere. But it was demilitarized, no Egyptian tanks, no Egyptian troops. So Israel got its security. So Israel would get more security with the demilitarized Sinai because it's the entire Sinai, it's not just a slice. And Egypt would get more sovereignty because they would get the whole thing back. So this is what you look for, it's those kind of creative ideas. Now, it's one thing to have a creative idea, but it's another thing to make it operational and really pass the muster of all the skeptics and so on. So the Americans drafted up a piece of paper and they went to the Israelis and the Egyptians and said, look, here's an idea. Don't consider this a formal American proposal. It's not, it's just a wild idea. We don't want you to accept it. We don't want you to say yes or no. All we want you to do is criticize it. Well, no one likes to say yes to a tough decision, no leader, but everybody loves to criticize. So the Egyptians criticized it, the Israelis criticized it, the Americans said, fine, fine, fine. And then they went back and said, how do we make this idea better? What changes can we make to address the Egyptian concerns, to address the Israeli concerns? And they went to draft number 2. Then they went back and said, no decision, just more criticism, please. They went to draft number 3. In 10 days, they went through 23 drafts, each time to the point where they could make it no better, that one text. And then at that point, Carter took it to Begin and to Sadat and said, look, this is the best we can do. Do you want it or not? And then President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin were faced with a very different decision than having to make a very painful concession. No one wants to make concessions. No one wants to be the first to make concessions. No one wants to appear weak. But this time, instead of having to make a number of painful concessions, all they have to do is make one decision. Do we want it or not? Only when they can see exactly what they're going to get in return for it. Sadat could see he was going to get the entire Sinai back, which is what he wanted. Begin could see that he was going to get security and an unprecedented peace with Egypt. And on those conditions, both leaders agreed. That was the Camp David Agreement. That was the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, which has endured to this day more than more than 45 years later, through wars, through assassinations, through all the changes, that treaty's endured. And it was an example for me of where creativity, collaboration, having a balcony place like Camp David, you were able to take a seemingly impossible war situation and transform it into a peace. Now, is the conflict over between Egypt and Israel? No, it still goes on, but it's changed from a destructive form of war to a more constructive form. And that, to me, is what we need to do now in the Middle East. We need to do it now in the Ukraine. We need to do it now between, United States and Europe. Wherever you look, we need that same kind of possibilist kind of thinking to be able to transform conflicts, not end them. We may not end the conflict, but we can transform the way we deal with them.